Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be at Farm Fest here in the Redwood Falls County. And I want to start off by saying, everywhere I go in Minnesota, what I hear from Minnesotans is, it's time. It's time to have that big, wide open, transparent campaign. We've heard lots of politicians speak. We've heard a lot of ideas from Tim Walz. You've heard a fair amount of ideas from Scott Jensen. But more than anything, I think Minnesotans want to have the conversation. And I do too. So I look forward to having a conversation with Governor Walz tomorrow morning at 10:30 here. I was disappointed to learn from Almanac that Governor Walz has nixed the potential debate on public television on August 12th. And I was disappointed to hear that he will not be debating me at Game Fair at the end of August. But what we need to do as Minnesotans is we need to change paths. Where we're at right now is not sustainable. That's why these men and women are standing behind me, because if we can put this together and really bring about change in Minnesota, we know that the path we're on right now is not sustainable. Over and over again, over the last 2 months, we've put forward 10-point plans to try to be real in terms of the short term, the midterm, and the long term. How can we fight inflation? How can we get public safety back on our streets? What can we do? We're going to be coming out with more on education and a variety of other topics. But today, it's all about rural prosperity and the rural economy. So I just want to introduce the people that have joined me on stage. I've got a bunch of volunteers, but I also want to say I've got Congressman Pete Stauber, I've got Secretary of State candidate Kim Crockett, I've got Senator Tori Western, Senator Gary Dames, Senator Bill Weber, Representative Paul Torkelson, and Senator Rich Draheim. It's these folks that will be able to implement the change Minnesota needs. So I'm going to dive right into our 10-point agricultural plan. First off, as a kid in Sleepy Eye who grew up in this neck of the woods and saw Del Monte put me through college, I drove lift truck and I only had one small accident. I chipped a curb, but please don't put that in the newspapers. But Del Monte was a huge part of my life. I started out walking the fields for rocks, then we baled hay, did a little milking of cows, and then it was Del Monte, and that was a huge promotion. I know what ag looks like. I know that the agricultural contribution to our economy is over 30%. I know that when you look at the people here at Farm Fest, these are people who in all walks of life are able to contribute to the sector of agribusiness, and we need to respect and appreciate that. And on behalf of some of the politicians in St. Paul that would dare to call you rocks and cows, I apologize. You should never have been called that. So let's dive into the 10-point program. First, we need to increase permit responsiveness. We are literally regulating and permitting our industries to death. It doesn't matter what you're trying to do. If you're trying to buy land, if you're trying to expand, if you're trying to build a new pole barn, over and over again. And recently we have the MPCA saying we're going to double the water charges for cattle and pork. Hopefully that will not go through. When I'm governor in January, it certainly will not. That's one. The next one, I'm going to go out of order because I would like to have Congressman Pete Stauber speak to the issue, is we need to keep the family farm in the family. This is a crisis. It's an emerging crisis. And I'm going to ask Congressman Stauber if he'd put a little flesh on the bone and tell us a little bit about his perspective in terms of keeping the family farm in the family, particularly in regards to estate taxes. Congressman.
Thank you very much. Yeah. It's great to be here with the next governor of this great state of Minnesota, Dr. Scott Jensen. Dr. Jensen, your message is resonating across the state. I want to give you a little perspective of the family farm in Washington, D.C. We must protect the family farm. We must hold these lands in small family farms like we're doing here in Minnesota. We cannot be selling this land to foreign countries, especially in North Dakota near an Air Force base. Right now the tensions in the world, it's a tinderbox. But what we need to do is have to make sure, and these men and women behind us know the value of the Minnesota small family farm. It's the backbone and it's the fiber of who we are as Minnesotans. And what I have to tell you today is I am pushing strong and hard to make sure that the family farm can thrive, succeed, and bring it to that next generation. And we're looking at, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act did a lot of good things, and especially for the family farm. But we need to, instead of just doubling the tax credit, we need to get rid of the death tax. I want to make sure that our family farmers can pass the farm on for generations, that rich history we have. And Dr. Jensen and Matt Burke and I have talked about that. I have all the faith that working together with Dr. Jensen and his administration and the Republicans in Congress, the family farm is not only going to exceed, but it's going to thrive, be prosperous, and lead the nation under Dr. Jensen and his leadership. So with that being said, I stand firmly resolved behind Dr. Jensen and Matt Burke and all of you who want to change the direction of our state and this nation. We live in the greatest country on earth, and don't let anybody tell you any different. The fact of the matter is, our best days are yet to come. Dr. Jensen.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I leave the family farm issue, I just want to share a few statistics. One, only 14 or 15 states have an actual state estate tax. Minnesota is one of them. In Minnesota, it's a $3 million non-portable per person exemption. Federal-wise, it's $12 million per person, and it's portable. That's part of the problem. The other thing is, when farmland goes from 2,000 to 10,000 to 15,000, you can start to see how relatively quickly a family farm of 400, 500 acres exceeds the 3 million plus the 2 million agriculture credit that they can have. But there's be a lot of family farms that are going to be over 5 million, and if you have to fracture or fragment them in order to deal with the estate tax, you at that point in time have made that family farm a sitting duck for some form of takeover. And over my dead body, will Minnesota ever change its legislation to allow corporations to buy family farms from out of country? That will not happen. We need to build rural roads. Right now, we've got farm-to-market roads that are in great need. The local road and bridge appropriation in the Minnesota Capital Investment Bill does not fund cities under 5,000. Now think about that. Cities under 5,000, they pay the gas tax, but they're not getting any money at all to help build their roads. I've traveled communities across Minnesota, and if they're underneath that 5,000 threshold, they're at a distinct disadvantage. The money's got to come from somewhere. You know what they're doing. That's got to stop. Third, we need to appoint top officials to reflect Minnesota. Right now, arguably, Governor Walz has approximately 35 cabinet members and key leaders. 35. Of those, a token 3, maybe 4, come from outside the 7-county area, the 7-county metro area. We need to be putting experts in positions like this, not politicians. The agribusiness is just hungry for people who understand what they labor under every day. We've got to do a better job. We need to enhance the farmer tax credit. That absolutely can happen. We want the beginning farmer to have an advantage so that they can go into farming. We need to promote and fund value-added crops. Matt Burke and I spent some time at the University of Minnesota, and it's exciting to see what they're doing with crops. Cover crops that exist through the winter. Cover crops that potentially could even, if you will, provide jet fuel for us someday. There's a variety of things, and we need to fuel that industry. Right now, I don't think we're telling our young people in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, or Redwood Falls, or Wilmer, or anywhere else, of all the opportunities there are in agribusiness. Whether you want to go into finance, inventory, sales, operations, accounting, if you want to be hands in the dirt, all of these are available. We need to be telling that to our young people. Communities like Sleepy Eye, Minnesota need to keep their young people in their community. Otherwise, it's a pretty tough path forward. We need to build out rural broadband. Some areas in greater Minnesota have terrific broadband, but many do not. And if you look at the 7-county metro area, you would be hard-pressed to find any area in the 7-county metro area that suffers in terms of lacking broadband connectivity like some areas in greater Minnesota. I don't think that there's been enough emphasis put on this. And when I was in the Senate for 4 years, it never seemed like greater Minnesota was really getting a seat in the front row. It was always, well, we'll throw them a bone. We've got to do better. Greater Minnesota needs to be absolutely connected. The horror stories I heard from moms and dads trying to engage in distance learning, where it would take 20, 30 minutes to upload 1 or 2 pages of a lesson plan, were just horrific. Next, E15 choices. I do support trying to allow and help all of our service stations put themselves in a position where they can provide blended biofuels. We can do that, and we can find the money in appropriations. And what that would allow us to do is do E15 year-round and allow us to explore and go into other areas in terms of blended fuels and allow all service stations to do that. Because right now, they do not all have that capacity. That would be a huge step for agriculture. We need to end the specific Minnesota fertilizer tax. Virtually every state in the nation does not do this, but Minnesota has a specific add-on tax for fertilizer. We've got a situation right now where farmers aren't even able to get their hands on fertilizer. And then when they do, they have to pay a special tax in Minnesota. And lastly, I want to elevate what the agribusiness is doing in regards to funding animal disease prevention. And I just got done talking to a pork producer. And these farmers are absolutely interested in being at the forefront of identifying potentially African swine fever, other diseases. We want to identify them. We want to contain them because farmers understand that if we don't do it at the front end, the lingering effects, the downstream effects, are going to go on not for months, but for years. We need to realize that farmers have been long committed to doing the right thing for sustainable farming. That's a little bit of a side note. I'll just say this. It astonishes me when I talk to people who exhibit a raw arrogance about the fact that farmers need help to do this or to do that. No, I grew up sleepy-eyed. You know what? Farmers don't need help, particularly from the arrogant urbanites. Honestly, the farmers are doing the good work. They're stewarding the land. They live here. Their kids live here. Their grandchildren live here. Nobody will steward the land better than the person who's dependent on it. So when we have this kind of attitude, we're absolutely destroying relationships, and we're certainly not building bridges. So those are the 10 points that I wanted to cover. I think Tim Walz has been long on rhetoric, and I don't think that he's done a great deal for agribusiness. And I would look forward to the conversation we're going to have tomorrow. But I'd love to stand for questions. This is a 10-point plan. How do we support agribusiness, remembering that this represents over 30% of Minnesota's economy? We lead in the nation in so many areas. I'm not going to list them all, but I've already said pork is number 2. Certainly Iowa's number 1 in pork. But whether you're talking about cattle, poultry, turkey specifically, no problems. Agribusiness is here to stay, and we need to support them. This will be our 10-point plan going forward. I'll be glad to stand for questions. Any questions?
I would say, I was just wondering, so Governor Walz, you know, he's supported rural broadband, ethanol has been a thing of his too, some of these other things, disease prevention, you know, certainly Senator Western could speak to the broadband efforts of the legislature, but I wanted to know, could you contrast yourself with the governor more on these? Like, where do you think you really draw the difference if, on generalities,
the question is,
how
how would I contrast myself with Governor Walz? Well, let's start with the California car mandates. I would say that in January, we will stop that right then and there. This is a crisis. An F-150 electric pickup in January in Minnesota potentially has a range of less than 200 miles before you have to stop and find a charging station. Good luck with that. And then sit still for 30 to 40 minutes to get the charge. This is a crisis. The range is less than 200 miles. We are hooked to the California rules. And California has added rules since we got hooked to them. And if you actually look at some of those, they're not stopping just at electric vehicles. They're stopping at internal combustion engines. They're basically saying that by 2035, they don't want internal combustion engines. How does that work for Minnesota with our lawnmowers, our gardening equipment? How does that work for tractors in the field? This is a crisis, and it's a crisis that Governor Walz created. We're forcing car dealers to have on their lots vehicles that they don't want to have. It's going to raise their costs. They are going to pass those costs on to their customers. We are also creating an inventory that isn't necessarily desirable for the market. So this is not a market-driven solution at all. This is a heavy-handed government downwards pressure, and this is wrong. And I think lastly, we've got to speak to the issue of supply chains. If we were able to hit the target that President Biden has set, 50% of vehicles by 2030, the supply chain necessary to do that, to charge them, to put the batteries together, to build this, 90% of that supply chain doesn't even exist. So that would be the initial contrasting point. The second contrasting point is, it was Governor Walz who for the first 3 to 3.5 years advocated over and over again, wanting to increase the state gas tax by 70%. That would be another distinguishing point. The third thing, when it comes to adding broadband connectivity to greater Minnesota, I'm not talking about posturing. I'm not talking about some pittance. I'm talking about leading on it. Let's get this done. I don't think that Governor Walz has brought that kind of leadership to it. And frankly, I think that he does owe Minnesota an apology. People, my friends, my neighbors who live in Sleepy Eye or wherever else they live, they don't really care to be called rocks and cows. These are hardworking businesswomen and businessmen, and they deserve to be respected. And I don't think they were. So those would be a few contrasts. Next question.
You talk a little bit about wanting to promote some of these value-added crops, support E15 choices. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about how you do that? Are there incentives for farmers or for gas stations that provide those other options?
Well, sometimes, like if you look at some of what the University of Minnesota is doing, sometimes it's a funding question. And we talked to some of the professors at the university and said, do you get caught up in the fight for the funds? And they said, yeah, we do sometimes. So that would be one area where instead of, if you will, putting dollars to a large 30,000 foot kind of a structure, target them. That would be one thing we could do. In terms of E15, if we were able to get all of our service stations with the capability to do aggressive biofuel distribution, that would be good for Minnesota. Some states haven't done that, and they paid a price for that. And that's why I think the E15 summer, year-round would be helpful. But again, we need to make certain that all service stations can do that. So I think the Senator Dames had submitted a bill in terms of providing some assistance for blending fuels, where all stations would be, if you will, given support to get to that level. I think the statistic, it might have been something like 65% funded by the state and 35% by the owner. And in that way, we could, if you will, secure our ability to distribute blended biofuels. I think the other things we could do is when we see added taxes for fertilizer, we're hurting farmers. We're taking capital away that they can't put in other areas. So I think we have got to reduce the taxes. And lastly, I think that we really do want to focus attention on the family farm. This is a part of the American heritage. It's a part of the Minnesota heritage. I don't think we realize the downside of having Minnesota agriculture corporatized. And so often we're reacting after we've allowed the snowball to run too far down the hill. So I really think that we need to have that broad, robust discussion. What can we do to keep the family farm in the family? And one of the things we could certainly do would be to address the estate tax and certainly provide some increased enhanced tax credit for the farms, the homestead, beyond what we're doing at the present time. Thank you.
How does that fertilizer tax work? What's presently dedicated to?
I believe that it's an add-on, and I think I'm thinking it's 1 or 2%, but I don't know the specific numbers. I know that when you look at the 50 states in the union, I think it's a handful or less that actually have a tax on fertilizer.
It is dedicated to something, right? It doesn't go to the general fund, it goes to
I don't know if that's going to research. It's probably going to research, but I don't know if that research channel is going through the general fund or if it's a specific dedicated account. Do you know? Yeah, Tori, that'd be great. Please do. Senator Tori Western.
On that fertilizer tax, it goes to research, but it doesn't say farmers would have to continue paying for it. We have many other funds that fund environmental benefits, and so that would be another way to take it off, the tax off the farmers. Fund that research from other sources. General fund would be another way we would fund it. Right now, the farmers have to pay for all that research that the rest of the state benefits from.
Senator Western, while you're out there, can you talk a little bit about how this plan is different from what you've seen coming from the administration?
Well, this plan would put farmers in charge and small business owners, and rural Minnesota be respected for the innovation and the hard work they put forward, rather than having growing government agencies like we've just now heard the PCA and the governor is pushing nearly doubling the water charge on livestock farmers. They're all over this area around Farm Fest, all over my district in central and western Minnesota, and that's a big contrast. And while I'm here, I'm going to just touch on what was asked by one of you earlier on rural broadband. The contrast is no clearer than what we saw on rural broadband this past session. The Senate, specifically the Senate GOP, Dr. Jensen's party, led the charge on rural broadband. It's the Senate Republicans that had to drag the governor and the House Democrats across the goal line in the very last day of session to commit the $210 million of federal money towards putting 75% of that to rural broadband in the ground infrastructure, as opposed to putting it into a special pot that the governor and the Democrats would have used otherwise for other projects, not committing it to rural broadband. So while it was a great bill that passed, it was led by the Senate Republicans to make that happen. That's the difference in commitment to rural Minnesota that Scott Jensen is talking about.
Senator, can I follow up really quick? Yeah. So 10-point plan, I know you're probably in favor of all of them, but could you pull out one or two that you think would make the most difference for people in rural areas or farmers, like that would immediately change people's lives for the better, the most out of all the 10 things here?
Well, they're all good, but let's talk about three. The one I just talked about, rural broadband, and how much that impacts farmers and rural residents. Everything from monitoring their crops, deciding how much fertilizer to put on their fields, running their GPS systems and other technologies that can help spread fertilizer where it's needed, less where it's not, run their operations, help monitor their livestock barns. That's how important rural broadband is, but it's also that home office that can now be in Sleepy Eye or Alexandria or any rural community if you have that high-speed internet availability to work from home, do telehealth, sell your products directly to the marketplace. So that rural broadband is a huge issue. I'm glad to see Dr. Jensen making that such a priority. The tax policies and new tax credits for starting farmers, that's also very important to help that younger generation get started. And lastly, speeding up the permit processes so we can have agribusiness actually thrive and grow in this state, and quit hearing the stories like True Shrimp or others that wanted to start in this state but then end up going to a neighboring state to build because the permits or other regulations are so burdensome in Minnesota. I hear it over and over. Many states, they can get a permit in less than a week. Minnesota, it's months or years, and that's hurting agriculture in rural Minnesota.
Dr. Yes. You were saying that farmers don't want, and you used the phrase arrogant urbanites tell them what to do. Could you put context around that? What were you talking they don't want?
Sure. The question is, can I put some context around my phrase when I said arrogant urbanites? I have the blessing of practicing family medicine for the last 36 years on the western side of Carver County. So I get a true mix. I get a true mix of people that come from Wayzata Golden Valley. I get that external ring suburb group, and I get dairy farmers and hog farmers, though not so many hog farmers anymore out in that area. And there is an attitude that I think we all bring to the table. It might be an understanding attitude, it might be one of arrogance, but what I hear from the people that are involved in farming in my area is they're really frustrated with the fact that, especially in St. Paul, they feel like people make assumptions that farmers don't want to steward the land, that farmers won't take care of the land unless somehow the legislature guides their activities. It feels ugly, and it would feel ugly for me if someone did the same thing to my profession. So I think in terms of trying to provide some context, you got to realize nobody stewards land better than the people who live on it. And farmers were the ones who came up with some of the hybrid crops, some of the creative cover crops, the way to irrigate the fields, the way to drain the fields. They were doing these things before legislatures started making rules. You can imagine how farmers feel when all of a sudden the DNR comes in and says, well, this land has to be taken out of production because this has got to be a buffer strip. And yeah, we know you paid for it, and we know you're paying property tax on it every year, but no, we're not going to give you credit for it. You just have to take it out of production. You don't get to do with it what you want, but you have to live with that because we know better than you do. And the farmer can look at it and say, that hasn't seen a drop of water in 50 years. It doesn't matter. We defined it as needing a buffer zone. So I think that there's got to be greater sensitivity coming from, if you will, the urbanites to greater Minnesota. Because, frankly, Brian, it's ugly. And I think that the agribusiness has every reason at times to feel like they've got people who don't know what they're talking about trying to tell them how to do their business.
As part of your CAS plan, you said you'd try to repeal the minimum markup law. That has since been removed from the website. Is there?
That's a good question. The question was our initial gas plan. We talked about the minimum markup. We went out and had a conversation with people, and they said there's a better way to retrieve cost savings on a gallon of gas. And so that's why we removed that, because there was the potential that that would have downstream effects that might be adversely affecting some businesses. So we pulled that off and said, let's go in this other direction. And that's what we're doing.
The permitting issue, you know, True Shrimp was pretty early in Governor Walz's tenure, right? Can anybody speak to, do you think he's improved at all? Do you think that's gotten any better? I know he's got a new PCA commissioner. The old one maybe you all didn't like as much. What do you get the sense of in the last year or so?
Well, perhaps I've traveled the state the most, and I can tell you this. I don't think people are impressed. I think if there were two words that would describe the way in which both the DNR and the MPCA operate, I think people would oftentimes say, especially greater Minnesota folks would say, it's burdensome and it's heavy-handed. And I think if it's been improved, I don't think the improvement has been dramatic enough that people are saying, wow, this is getting better. I think a lot of people out there are saying, this doesn't feel like one Minnesota. This feels like we're getting badgered. And again, I think people that live in the 7-county metro area sometimes don't realize that some of these policy decisions, you don't get a mulligan. You don't get a do-over. If we lose companies like Arctic, Polaris, Swans, 3M, Best Buy, Target, Cargill, if you lose these kind of companies, Minnesota is going to be in a world of hurt, and I would submit that we're in a world of hurt right now. I would submit that Governor Walz's impression and interpretation of where the economy is at in Minnesota is horrifically off base. When I have patients in my office crying about what to do with the last $100 they have, fill their gas tanks so they can get to work or buy groceries for their family, something's terribly wrong. And I don't want to hear that 1.8% unemployment rate means that everything's hunky-dory. Sorry, folks, it's not. When you've got inflation at 9.1% and you've got people getting the biggest raises they've gotten in years at 5% and they're falling further behind, when you've got more than 90% of your income, of your discretionary dollars going to just taking care of the basics of life, when you've got over 60% of Minnesotans going check to check, paycheck to paycheck, there's a huge problem. If you want to really look at something that tells you how Minnesota economy is doing, ask how many Minnesotans are working today. We're not up to pre-COVID levels. If you really want to know what's happening in Minnesota's economy, ask yourself what GDP growth is doing. We're in the bottom half of this nation. So I think that Governor Walz is doing exactly what people expect politicians to do. Picking a metric out of the air and say, hey, see, aren't I doing a wonderful job? We're not buying it. And that's frankly why we'd like to have the debates. Let's have the discussions moderated by good people like you asking hard questions. How can you ask your hard questions of both of us if you won't see him on the stage debating us? Why would we not debate? Why would he cancel the Almanac debate? Why would he not go to Game Fair? Why would we not talk about fishing and hunting? When does this stop? When is Minnesota going to say enough? This is just freezing on his part, and it's reminiscent of too much of what we've seen of his leadership style.
All right, one more question.
Folks, it's warm. I notice you probably realize the temperature in this room is slightly higher than 75 degrees, but I really appreciate you coming. And there'll be free towels given over at the DFL booth. Just kidding. Have a good